Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Indigenous Perspectives on Climate Justice. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor and Director of our Economic Justice Program here at Nonprofit Quarterly. I'm coming to you from Boston on Massachusetts land. This webinar marks a first for us in that we're featuring 3 articles from our latest Nonprofit Quarterly magazine in a section guest edited by Raymond Foxworth of the First Nations Development Institute. Today, our panelists are Ade Romero Briones, who's Director of Programs of Native American and Food Systems at First Nations in Colorado. Trisha Kaholani Watson-Sprout leads an environmental planning consultancy in Honolulu, Hawaii, and serves on 2 nonprofit boards there. And we are joined by Kendra Kloster, who serves as Executive Director of Native Peoples Action based in Anchorage, Alaska. A few notes before we get started. First, we're very excited to take your questions. We have a few introductory slides, and I'll ask the panelists some prepared questions, and then we'll gladly field yours. Please enter your questions into the questions box at the bottom of your screen. I will share as many of them as I can with the panelists. Second, we will be sharing the recording by email after the webinar. So please don't ask, will I get the recording? You will. One last thing, this webinar is free, but producing these webinars is not. So if you like what we are doing and can support NPQ's economic justice work, please consider making a donation today. You can also join the conversation via social media with our hashtag, Rebuild the Economy. Thanks for joining us. And with that, we'll begin. And next slide, please. So I just want to point out that we have a bunch of webinars that are going to be coming up at Nonprofit Quarterly. We have our next one will be on Wednesday, October 28th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. And it'll look at mutual aid in the cities of Chicago, Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Atlanta. And in the chat, there should be a link shortly that links to that registration page. So please sign up for that as well. And with that, I want to pass the baton to Ade Briones, who will talk a little bit about the history of environmental justice and climate justice in Indian country.
Gwetsi hopa hin wakani me asa watyat kotiete me osuta. So my job today is kind of to give some context and to set the stage for Kehao and Kendra, who will go into more detail about our specific subject areas. And it's a real honor today to be on a webinar with Steve and Kehao and Kendra. It's like a dream come true. So before we get started, just some context. You know, I think in 2020, First Nations and probably Kehao and Kendra, who work for Indigenous organizations and Indigenous people have probably had similar happenings, is that there's been a lot of interest in Indigenous people. There's a lot of questions about how we get from unhealthy to healthy, or how we take climate disruption to climate stability. And we get a lot of questions about TEK. Tell us about traditional ecological knowledge. And so knowing that that's the environment in which we come today, I just want to remind people that there is a lot of things happening in our country. There is a lot of things that are happening in the world. We have fires in California. We have a global pandemic. We have sea level risings. We have species extinction. I mean, it's a pretty glim profile right now, but every day I wake up so happy to be Indigenous. Every day I wake up to this little bluebird that screams at my window. You know, right now I'm in California. I run the California office for First Nations, and it screams at me every morning. And so it makes me happy. It's a way of me interacting with everything around me. And this is not a romanticized notion. More and more, we're seeing people do land acknowledgements And for us as Indigenous people, waking up with that blue jay every morning and saying good morning to my friend is my land acknowledgement. It's my way of acknowledging that I share this space and this land with people and beings that have come before me. And so oftentimes those things are romanticized, but those are the ways that we acknowledge the beings before us, but also make them part of our own stories. And so this idea of land acknowledgements is really important to the whole conversation about environmental justice. So some of the insights and the words that my sisters on the webinar offer you today, I hope you hear with open hearts and open minds. And also note that in an Indigenous community, there is no observer. There's always participation. Whether you're watching the dance or you're listening to the story, you're an active participant. And to be an active participant, you must open your heart and open your mind. And really, we're offering you a chance today to broaden your own stories. Like, we're often told, and I have dates here on our screen, we're often told the story begins in 1492 when Columbus sails across the Pacific. But if you read Kehao's article, she mentions that the timelines are off, right? If we're talking about environmental disruption that begins in the 19th and 20th century, we're already too late. And that part of that story comes from the false timeline that we often begin the narrative of our lands and our society, when in reality, things have happened much longer before 1492. And we don't want to be late, right? So we want to get these timelines correct. We want to tell the real stories. And that's part of our job as a society, is to start telling those real narratives. And when we look at some of if we start at 1492, some of these things follow. 1578, the Pacific is explored. But we got to remember, like, Drake named the Pacific as a way to claim those lands for his empire. But the Pacific was well traveled much before 1578. There are stories about California Native people trading with Polynesians much sooner than 1578. And those are the stories that are not often told. And those are the stories that often hold some of the truest solutions to the experiences that we're having today. But with that being said, there's a lot of colonization that has been institutionalized in some of our modern institutions. The Wilderness Act, for example, has a definition of wilderness that espouses no human intervention, and that was created in 1964. We have the creation of the state of Alaska that changed the way Indigenous people interact with our lands. And those timelines are much sooner. Those are timelines of our grandparents, so they're not too far off. So our timelines are really important when it comes to the conversation around environmental justice. And it's time that we start telling the truth about how our society was created and how we've come to the point we are today. And again, I offer you, we're here to talk story. There's really no template for what we're going to discuss today, except for maybe some pre-planning. But I welcome your thoughts. We welcome your questions. And again, we welcome you into this space to talk about Indigenous brilliance. Okay, Hal?
Howard, you have the floor.
My name is Trisha Keholani Watson Sproat. I am the owner of Honua Consulting, which is a cultural resource management firm I started about 20 years ago here in Hawaii. I'm also the president of the Kalihi Palama Culture and Art Society, which is an organization focusing on cultural arts in Hawaii. We lead a annual competition named after Queen Liliuokalani for children. And I'm also vice president of Aina Momona, which is an environmental nonprofit led by an all Native Hawaiian board that services Hawaiian communities throughout Hawaii. That was a lot of Hawaii's. So I just want to talk about, sort of set the stage for some definitions as to what we're going to be talking about. This infographic you see in front of you comes from the Climate Justice Alliance, which is a wonderful organization that has been working on just transition and climate issues for a number of years. And this is a very complicated, detailed infographic, but what you need to know is the idea of climate justice really does involve moving from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. So I would very much recommend people go and check out the Climate Justice Alliance website. And then you also see they have Indigenous principles of a just transition that are provided by the Indigenous Environmental Network. So that's an excellent resource if you want to learn more about this issue. Next, please. This is a great infographic from the Capitalist Institute, which is an organization that looks at regenerative economies. So that is another resource I would recommend, but a regenerative economy does look at things like justice, a circular economy, how do you develop, rebalance power and things like that. So that's another excellent resource, and we'll be talking about a regenerative economy, or Kendra will. Next. And another great term to know is intersectional environmentalism. So this is more seen now in the building industry. The US Green Buildings Council is doing some great work around intersectional environmentalism to bring issues of justice and power into the built environment. So those are just a couple of terms I wanted to highlight before we got started on questions. Thanks, Steve.
Great, thanks so much. I think I want to have the first question just to get Kendra in the conversation. So, I mean, all of you wrote excellent articles which are available online, and I encourage everyone on this webinar to read if you haven't already. But in your article, you outline a framework that Native Peoples Action has developed that outlines 5 elements of a just transition. And so could you outline what a Indigenous just transition entails?
Sure, and I'll start with a quick introduction as well. So Kendra Kloster, I am Tlingit, originally from Wrangell and Juneau, which is the southeast part of Alaska. I currently live on Dena'ina lands in Anchorage. I'm a mama, which is my favorite role, and also what really fuels a lot of my work is just thinking about what are we doing for our future generations. What I think about, what kind of Alaska am I going to leave them? I also the executive director of Native Peoples Action and Native Peoples Action Community Fund. They're two nonprofits, kind of sister organizations that we work together in the work that we do. So getting to your question, an Indigenous just transition, it's about revitalizing and reclaiming, looking at just transition as an Indigenous worldview. We just heard about colonization and all the different, there's so many different impacts, and the way that our world has really changed and gone away from our Indigenous knowledge base. We're really out of balance. And we're not centering what needs to be centered. So we're going back to the framework, and that's what guides our climate justice strategy, is we're redefining or more returning to a more true economy by centering our core values of home, traditions, and spirituality. We need to be more in alignment with nature. This is the way that Indigenous people have lived for thousands of years. It's really been put off balance. And so we're looking at this economy that we're in now. It's much more extractive right now. We're thinking about what can we extract from the land, whether it's mining, oil, and not thinking about how we're impacting our future, how we're impacting those lands. So what we're really doing is it's going back to that Indigenous knowledge base. How do we live in balance? How do we build an economy with home and tradition and spirituality as our center and living back in balance?
Great, thanks. So I wanted to get both Kehao's and Ade's articles into the discussion as well. I mean, there's a lot that can be said about both of them, but one of the themes that came out pretty clearly was the need to decolonize environmentalism and sort of the violent history of environmentalism. You know, that basically Native Americans were wiped off the land in order to create these conserved spaces. I don't know, which of you wants to jump in first?
I think a day. That's a. No, I was gonna put it. I was like, a day could go first.
Okay.
Yes. Well, when we use the term decolonizing, you know, it's a loaded term, and oftentimes we use that term to think about when it's referred to Indigenous people. I don't use that term because I think one of the most important things to remember about Indigenous communities is that we've always been tied to our traditions and our land, regardless of what the history says. Like, we have always fought for the right to our lands, the right to our foods, the right to care for our people, the right to say the names of the places that we come from. And that's really important. That's decolonizing really refers to these terminologies that were brought to us by Western society, like environmentalism. And environmentalism at its core is like already a separation of people from the places that we exist in. And that needs to be decolonized. That needs to be changed. That needs to be reviewed and redefined, because Indigenous people have always somehow been outside of it, because from its inception, these were concepts that were brought to us from people who were not from our lands, people who came to Europe, people who were new to the places that we call home. And they needed a way to describe it, and to describe it with the absence of Indigenous people. And so when we think about environmentalism in its inception, from like white men who were surveyors, who are looking to map out the lands, who are looking to write down where all the natural resources are so that they can then extract them and send them to Europe, that needs to be decolonized, and it hasn't yet, because we see some of those very definitions and beginnings being codified in law. Like the Wilderness Act in 1964 still has the term wilderness as a term that means the absence of people. Or we have like the inception of statehood, like Alaska and Hawaii, who claim like that's the beginning of time, when they're like, so many things happened before 1959. And those are ways of like erasure and keeping Indigenous people separated from these terms that we've come to associate with like the protection of land, when in reality, you know, it's kind of based on a falsehood. But I'll stop there because I could go on and on. Okay, how?
No, thank you. And I when you were talking, it reminded me, first and foremost, I wanted to thank Nonprofit Quarterly and First Nations for even doing this series, because as Ade said, Indigenous people have been so categorically excluded and marginalized from so many of these discussions. I remember over the last 20 years of my career, just always feeling like an outsider to discussions on environmentalism. You know, Indigenous people didn't have a place. Ade's absolutely right. Protected areas are, you know, people get so excited about protected areas, but I remember sitting in a seminar with a federal agency once, and I didn't get where the disconnect was. Like, all my hamsters were running in my brain. And at some point, somebody said, well, our version of a protected area doesn't include people. And like, this was such a light bulb for me, because that made no sense to me, because we were people on the land. We were people who cared for the land. Land was not about stewardship, but kinship. So, you know, this evolution we've seen, where we're now starting to have discussions about where does traditional ecological knowledge come in? Where does people who have lived on the land and have these deep relationships with land and resources play into the picture is so critical to moving forward. So I think it's just the fact that we're having this discussion is critical. The fact that we seem to be slowly turning a corner on all of this is important. And as Ade said, right, we have to start to work together. I mean, I think now more than ever, this idea that environmentalism is here and an Indigenous rights movement is here is not going to get us, people or the planet where we need to be. So I think that's what's so exciting. And I think that's a good dovetail into Kendra's work on a regenerative economy. Is that possible, Steve? Can we do that?
It is the next question. So Kendra, you wrote about some of the policy initiatives in Alaska and stuff, so please.
Yeah, so I come from a policy background. I kind of nerd out in that. And some of the things I just want to comment on too was when we think about Indigenous people, like for, the state of Alaska, nowhere in our constitution or in our state statutes does it talk about Indigenous people. We're like not even mentioned at all. And so it's really a fight to say like you are Indigenous land everywhere you step in Alaska, and we're all interconnected. And I absolutely agree that's something that we work on at Native Peoples Action and with other organizations is building those working relationships, those friendships with all different groups. And that's, our tribes, our Native people, but also the environmental groups. And we know that in order to make change, that we have to do that together to push these policies to be done. And when looking at the different policies here in Alaska, it's really, when we're looking at climate justice, it's just such a lack of leadership. And it's almost, we started talking about climate justice and climate change, and it was almost like a bad word, like, don't bring that up, you're going to ruffle feathers. And so now we're kind of like, no, you know what, we're going to be in your face about it because this is our home. We are seeing just over the last few years, we're looking at, ice that's been melting that has been really impacting Alaska because we're losing lives because of climate change. We're seeing fires in Southeast Alaska, which is a rainforest, and just massive fires all over our state. We're seeing erosion where we have villages that are, falling into our rivers and our ocean, and they're not being addressed. And so what we're having to do is really go to our policymakers and say, hey, look, climate change is real. It is happening, and we're going to show you. And that's, when you read through our articles, we just had a few examples, of things that are happening here in Alaska. And I know there's many examples throughout the world and throughout, the US, but it's just being ignored. And so some of the things that we're talking about is, when we're doing big projects, is they need to consider what's going to be happening on the climate. You need to have that with any project that you're going to be doing, whether it's transportation or, of course, we're a big oil state and mining. But further than that is we have to get beyond this idea of this extractive economy, that's what we have to live in, because that is not a balanced economy. And right now, we have people that are willing to give up things like our fish. We can talk about Pebble Mine, where they want to put a mine in the headwaters of Bristol Bay where you could impact and kill off our fish, which is a huge industry. It's not only our traditional way of life that we live, and we have such an interconnectedness with our salmon, and it also provides jobs, it provides food across the world. And you have people that are willing to push through and say, well, no, we need to do a mine right here because that's the kind of economy that we're living in. And they're not looking at the full picture of, you're willing to go in and mine at the headwaters of Bristol Bay, yet you're going to be giving up this amazing, just so many amazing things in this region. And so our tribes and our people are having to fight at every single angle. And this is just one example of many. So how do we get to that? And that's where, we come back into our just transition, is we need to go back and living with the land. We're not separate. We all just talked about that. We're not separate. We live off the land. I want to ensure that my kids can be out berry picking, and we're going to be out fishing. And this is the way that we live here. And so these are big changes and big impacts that we are making, and we're going to be pushing this at every single level. We're looking at local level. You know, we've had some successes there. In 2019, Anchorage passed a climate action plan, and so they're coming up with a strategic framework. So we've had more successes on the local level, but we're continuing to push to the state level and up to the federal level. But we have to do this together. We have to do this in partnership. And yeah, we're doing that here at the state, but I can't wait to, I get to meet all these amazing people in my job where I know we're all fighting for the same thing, and we're starting to lock arms and say, all right, now we're going to push this together. And so that, I don't know, I'm so thankful. And again, I also want to say thank you for Nonprofit Quarterly of allowing us to come on and inviting us in this space and to talk about it. Because I do think that people are starting to notice more, and we're going to keep having these conversations. So yeah, I just want to say thanks for having us on.
Thanks, Kendra. Ajay, do you want to talk about, you write about regenerative agriculture, and there's a way of starting that where Native communities are co-creators of that, and there's the way that's been done in the past where that hasn't been the case. So what do we need to do to make regenerative agriculture, work this time?
Well, first, I think when we talk about regenerative, we're coming at two different angles. Like, on one hand, we're talking about like a society that's trying to figure out how to correct some of the damaging production practices that agriculture has created. But when we're talking with Indigenous communities, we're coming from the other side of the screen, because we've been in our lands, right? We've whether or not we're removed from them, we have a land base and we have a home. And when you're on that land for generations upon generations upon generations, any kind of system you create has to be able to support, have a carrying capacity for that population. And so the fact that we've been tied to our lands and that we know where our homelands are means that we had to have a regenerative system of operation, whether that be food production, whether that be social interaction, whether that be cultural interaction, it had to be regenerative. And so when we're talking about regenerative now, sometimes the Indigenous population and the mainstream population, they're coming at two different perspectives. And so when we talk about regenerative agriculture coming from a mainstream perspective, it's just like getting started. Yes, it's based on a lot of concepts of Indigenous people, but it's really a discussion about correcting past production systems. When we're talking, and so like when you think about it that way, we need to always like hear Indigenous people, hear the stories. And one, agriculture didn't begin when settlement started in America. Agriculture, food production, hunter, fishermen had successful food production systems far before then, but we never hear about them, right? We hear that like the colonizers came and the settlers came and they like planted these beautiful gardens and America started, right? That's not the story we should be telling our kids, because it's damaging to everyone and it's excluding all the solutions that are possibly out there to correct some of those damaging production practices. So really, like, we need to start retelling the narrative of our country and retelling the narrative of how these systems began, because the one that we have right now that's in all the history books across the country is damaging. It's not part of a regenerative system already.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, I was going to ask you if you wanted to talk about climate policy and what that looks like if it's in, if it were to be centered in Native Hawaiian knowledge and practices.
I'll answer that, but I want to answer some of the audience questions because they're really good. And I'm seeing, so I don't want to pull a Mike Pence on you and just not answer your question. But I do think climate policy can often be problematic. There was recently a law, so for those who read the article, I did talk about how there's just inequity when things like sea level rise and shoreline incursion. And what I realized after the session was there was a law passed this past session that creates obstacles for Indigenous people who are trying to care for their ancestral property on shoreline parcels. And I see one of the questions we got, so I'm going to pivot quickly.
Go for it.
Is, how can people be supportive? And what can people do? So I would recommend, I scribbled down 3 things. 1, provide direct support. So whether that's funding, since we are talking to Nonprofit Quarterly, or services. So we have a project on Molokai where we're clearing land, but we want to put up compost toilets and different structures. So I will ask civil engineers I know, hey, can you come do this for us for free? So I think for people who are professionals, of which many I see in the chat, some of them I even know, who are talented and smart and can provide services to help as we do, regenerative ag or other things, or for Native Alaskans, if they need to fight, a permitting process, provide your pro bono support. It is a huge help because that reduces costs for Indigenous communities. Second, help remove barriers. So oftentimes we'll have trouble with right of entries or permitting processes. I did a project from 2012 to 2016 to streamline the permitting for traditional Hawaiian fish ponds. We had to go through 16 different authorizations and 12 different agencies to be able to restore fish ponds that provide critical ecosystem services for shorelines. So things like that, like we had ponds who couldn't be restored for decades because the permitting process was so complicated. So I think when we're talking about policy, enable Indigenous communities as opposed to disable them. And then third, and this is not for everybody, but I think what sometimes can happen is, my third actually is get out of the way. Often in Indigenous communities, you have people who are not Indigenous that take space where you could be cultivating Indigenous leadership. And that's really critical. I mean, ultimately, the key to improving in policies for Indigenous people or supporting Indigenous people means Indigenous leadership. So part of it is, and I've written about this before in Nonprofit Quarterly, is knowing when to get out of the way and helping restore balance for places that really were once led by, sustainably and successfully by Indigenous people, by helping bring up those Indigenous peoples again.
Great, thanks, Tricia. And there's a really good article that some of your colleagues in Hawaii wrote on fish ponds in Nonprofit Quarterly back in the spring, so you can look for it on our website. Kendra, I wanted to ask you about, you talk about creating a sort of balanced approach to environmental justice and climate change, and what does that look like, and how can that be action? I think you're on mute.
Yep, had to find my mute button. Sorry, can I just make one comment? I just want to say, Tricia, you really just said what I was thinking. And so I just wanted to say, I appreciate that. And we have those conversations in Alaska a lot. And I just wanted to add on, is let Indigenous people tell their own story. A lot of time people are telling our story when really it should be coming from us. And on top of that is working with your tribes, know what land that you're on. And so our governments are failing in the fact that they are not working with our tribes. The projects are happening, they're shoving them through without having any say in the communities. And so we really need to build our tribes and build these relationships together and really recognize our tribes are sovereign. We are sovereign tribes and we need to treat them that way. And a lot of times they're just feeling stepped on. So building those relationships, supporting Indigenous people, and letting us tell our own stories. I just wanted to add on that. Sorry, Steve. And sorry, you might have to repeat your question.
Oh, well, how do you actualize this idea of trying to balance and taking a balanced approach to environmental justice and and climate justice as a theme of your article. So.
Yeah. So I talked about this a little bit already when we talk about what the just transition is and how we live, and we go back, how we really start to living in balance, and how do we change the current system that we're in. Sorry, there's just a lot to unpack, I feel like. One of the, I guess I'm gonna kind of go off track a little bit, and sorry about that. One of the things, a lot of the policies that get set are being set and made without Indigenous people. And so when it's being led and you're saying, here's our policies, here's what we're going to do for our economy, you don't have Indigenous people sitting at the table. And so you're really missing a lot of the perspectives. You're missing what we need to change. And for us, when we're thinking about boards and commissions that are making rules about our hunting and fishing, when we have legislators making policies, and one, they're not working in close relationship with our tribes, and we don't have many Alaska Native people within the legislature. And so we need to be at those decision-making tables so we can be changing how we really live in balance. And we do have that problem of the permitting processes. We've seen that. We see how just how they can just kind of go through. They opened up a bunch of lands in Alaska to mining with one swift pen signature without really talking to people, without letting anyone know. And within their reports, which are pages and pages and pages long, that they expected our tribes to read, which are not even in people's first language. We have many people that are speaking our traditional languages still as their first language. And so looking at these reports that are super long, and then when you start reading through them, they're saying, oh, well, we can open up these lands to mining because it's not going to impact fish. No one is living their traditional lifestyle on here. They're just flat out wrong. And so then we have to go back and fight and say, wow, okay. And we don't have the funding resources to do that. And then you put these really large reports and expecting people who are, we still have, we still live off the land. We're still out hunting and we're fishing and not being taken into account. Like we're out hunting, and you're going to have this one meeting about what you're doing to our lands, and we're going to miss it. And you're going to say, oops, too bad. We're going to go ahead and do it because you didn't show up. So we really need to be, and this is kind of hard to say at times because this is not a system that's built for Indigenous people. When I say, okay, now you need to go run for office or you need to be on this commission, that's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with. These are systems that weren't built for us. There's systems built to conquer and to change. And so a lot of times when I talk to people, it's like, okay, we're going to go and how do we change that from the inside and make sure that we are at those decision-making tables? Because we want to return to this balance. We want to return to living in reciprocity with the land. This is something that is at the core of us, the core of our spirituality, our culture, and our language. So some of the things that we're doing right now is a lot of people were not afforded that opportunity to speak their language. That's something, that's happened to generations of people. They tried to wipe out Indigenous people. But we are very strong and we have not gone away, and we are bringing back, I would say not bringing back, but we're kind of bringing back the blanket and saying, okay, we're proud to be Indigenous now, and we're going to start relearning our languages and infusing our culture and bringing that wherever we go. And I just think that's so much part of the work. So, anyways, I could probably keep going on all the different things that I feel like that we need to do in doing policy work, but just in the way that we work and the way we work with our partners, I just want to say is, we have a lot of like coming together moments with our partners to say, okay, this is how we need to make sure that we're working well together with like environmental groups, right? So we are building those relationships, and also saying like, okay, now's the time to get out of the way. You can back us up on a lot of this work that we are doing. And also when you're for funding opportunities, a lot of times the funding was going to other groups that were doing work that should have been led by Indigenous people. And so I've been finding my voice a little bit more as I've been in this nonprofit world and saying, no, you need to fund us. You need to fund Indigenous led groups that are doing this work. And so I am becoming more bold in that way, and learning, kind of learning as I go here, but just finding my voice, because it's not, a lot of times it's not the way I grew up, is like demanding certain things or, asking for funding. That's just not something that that I'm necessarily comfortable with, but learning in this world that, you need to we have to stand up for each other and for ourselves, and just say, no, this is the time to get out of the way. This is a time to be a supportive partner, and we can really build our economy together in that way. So we are doing that with policymakers. We're doing that with partners, with organizations, and I have faith that we can go back and find this balance that we need to live in.
Great, thanks. That's really powerful.
Can I just make 2 points based on what Kendra said?
Sure.
I have a point too after.
Okay,
Yes,
then I do have some good audience questions that are going to follow up with that, but go ahead.
Okay, there's 2 really important points that Kendra made. One is that we are trying to exist and advocate for Indigenous practices in a system that wasn't created for us. And so what that should tell the audience is that, yes, we have TEK, yes, Indigenous people have solutions, but there's a lot of work that non-Indigenous people have to do too. I don't have a TEK solution to fix the definition of wilderness in the Wilderness Act, right? That's in a separate system. And that system, that work has to be done by some people in mainstream society. Kehal and I are both attorneys, right? We can figure it out, but like, that's a system that we're learning to operate in that wasn't built by us. So there are people who are inheritors of this system that should be working on those things too. So there's work that has to be done by non-Indigenous people as well. And the second thing is, Kendra mentioned funding. And when we, at First Nations, we work on funding, something like 0.05% of environmental justice funding goes to Indigenous-led nonprofits and communities. Like that's like pennies, that's like less than a penny on the dollar. And so that also should tell us something, that there is yes, people are asking us about TEK and Indigenous practices, but like nobody, like we're doing it with basically nothing, right? Like that in itself is an inequality.
So very quickly, I feel like Kendra said has just recapped my life over the last year. I totally agree. It's not natural for me to be bold in asking for money. That's just also not how I was raised. But she's right. Like, as women and as Indigenous people, I think we do need to start to step forward and be direct in what we're asking for. You should fund us. You should fund us because, you should be supporting Indigenous leadership. You should be funding Indigenous environmentalism. So that resonates very deeply with me. So I've also started to get more bold, as Aday knows, over the last year about saying where, people should be getting behind us, supporting us, or partnering with us, as opposed to basically taking away from Indigenous organizations and people who are on the land. And I think it's a microcosm of the larger system that we've talked about. This system of whether it's decolonization or injustice has inertia. It has weight and power and energy behind it. And it does take active resistance to change it, right? It's sort of basic physics to some degree. So it is very hard. I think it's a lot of things that come naturally to others, whether in the business world or the nonprofit world, don't come as easily to some of us. So I think that's another way where people can reach out and say, how can I help? Are there things we can do? Because Kendra's absolutely right. I 100% agree with what she said.
Great,
I
thanks.
get asked, how do you do all the work? And I said, we have a small but mighty team and we don't sleep a lot. So mamas, parents, we got to I've learned to multitask like no other, even more so now that we all work from home, we have kids at home. Yeah, I don't sleep a lot, but that's how we do the work because you know what? This is our heart work. This is what we're going to do, and we're going to keep pushing, and we're going to do this over and over. So, yeah, so to add that in.
Well, I want to get to some of the audience questions. And this one, I think this actually comes from an Indigenous viewer, and the person's asking, how can I support the pivoting in Western culture toward ecosystemic care? You can policy-wise call it the Green New Deal, what have you, while also speaking truth to the cultural appropriation of practices being declared as if this is Eureka or something new.
Just to help in the context first, if it's an Indigenous person, like more power to you. It's hard. Like there's no way around that to be true to your Indigenous self and to call out like appropriation or to call out like new discoveries. Like that is like an Indigenous burden that's really, really hard. The other thing is, I think Kehao and Kendra both said it, like it takes a lot of courage to be in the space where you are not surrounded by Indigenous people and Indigenous supports, and you kind of feel like you're the only one. And the caution that I have there is like, oftentimes, and I think we've all heard it in educational Western settings, is that we must be special. Like if you graduate from law school, you must be special. If you even graduate from high school, you must be special. And it's important to not only remind ourselves, but the people that we're talking to, that there are people in our communities who are probably more brilliant than we are, and we just happen to have the opportunities to be in these spaces. And like we can't remind people enough that I may be a Dave Briones, she may be Kendra and Kehao, but behind us we have ancestors, we have children, we have grandmas and grandpas, and those people are really the brilliance, and we just so happen to be the person that you're speaking to. So I think all of those things have to be constantly articulated in the spaces where Indigenous people find themselves surrounded by not only the institutions that support some of the colonialism, but the conversations that support those institutions.
Something I wanted to add on that that's been helpful for me when thinking about getting in these different spaces. We do this in sisterhood. So I'm going to give kind of an example. I recently got on the Public Safety Commission for the municipality of Anchorage. And there were 3 open seats at this time, and I called. It was on a Sunday, and I love to tell this story. My friend Akpek, her and I, we do a lot of work together. I called her on a Sunday. I said, "Hey, got an idea. I've been talking with some people. There's 3 open seats." And before I could even get it out of my mouth, she said, "Yes, whatever you need, Kendra. We're going to do this work. We're going to do it together. I trust you." I said, "Great. Okay, now this is what you just signed up for." And I explained it. And I said, "All right, now we need another person." So we got our friend Emily. So now we have 4 Indigenous women are on the Public Safety Commission for the municipality of Anchorage. This is huge. And this is huge because we're changing the conversation. We're changing this conversation to say, and a lot of the work that we do right now, comes from our communities of saying, what are the things that you're working on? So while we do a lot of climate work, we also do a lot of work around public safety and missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because this is something our communities have brought up. This is a crisis in our state and the country and the world. And so we need to make sure people are safe. And it's up to us to keep bringing up this conversation over and over and over again and making people address it. Well, now, I guess we infiltrated, you know what? Now you have to talk about it some more. And so those are some ways that we do it, as we work together in sisterhood.
Great. Yes. Thanks. So this is an interesting question too that came from the audience. And so this is a person who works in as an engineer in renewable energy. And so the person asks, says, I feel very torn between the good that my work might be doing in renewable energy and the fact that we're doing the renewable energy work with a capitalist mindset. So is there any advice you could give to someone in that position as far as, how to make the best use of their skills and talents?
So I'll answer that one. We recently, this past year, had some pretty intense protests. I think over 100 people were arrested about a windmill project. And I think, of course, Indigenous people are supportive of renewable energy, but there are justice issues about where are you placing these things? Is it appropriate to the environment? So one of the things that I think is really positive that came out of it, we just got, so I did not work on the windmill project, but we just got hired for a solar project to do a social justice assessment, which has never, as far as I know, has never been done in Hawaii. So and then in my article, I talk a little bit about the legislation that was passed that was really environmental justice legislation about buffer zones around landfills. So there are exciting things happening. And so for people in the industry, I would recommend something like that. In your EIS process, are you looking at justice issues? Are you looking at placement? Are you looking at impacts to Indigenous communities? Are you doing, so we are required by law here, if there's an EIS, to do a cultural impact assessment. Things like that, I think, are really critical. I think there are mechanisms to integrate into the process that allows for decision-making that can be just, that can be thoughtful, that can really ask the hard questions, in which, if you're able to think through it in that framework, then I think, of course, renewable energy is the absolute way to go, because it's moving away from an extractive economy to one that is in many ways regenerative.
And I would just add, Steve, to Kehao, because I think she said it perfectly, thinking through the process, if you're working on a project that is only going to serve a certain population over a certain income, we should be questioning how to make that project serve more people who are not above that income line, which happens a lot in renewable energy. Only a certain threshold of our population can actually access these renewable energy sources, and we need to change that. Kehao said it perfectly. That's extractive.
Yeah, thanks. So we got a ton of questions from folks on the Green New Deal, and I guess I'll read this one. To what extent are Indigenous perspectives and thoughts and history incorporated in the Green New Deal conversation, or is it absent? How do you view that whole debate?
So one thing first, I really would love opportunity. I don't know if you're sending a follow-up to answer a lot of the questions, because I think you got phenomenal questions from the audience that all deserve to be answered. So I'd like to start there. And then second, I don't feel like there's a lot of Indigenous thought perspective into the Green New Deal. I think I support it because I do think it's this move to a regenerative economy, but I think it has a very far way to go. And the parallel example I'll give is the SDGs out of the UN. Of course, they're good. We should all move in that way. But I know from when I was working with the UN that so much of what was specifically being advocated for by Indigenous people ended up on the cutting room floor. And that's always the case when you get to these large bodies and these large institutions. So we're having conversations here in Hawaii about how we implement it at a local level. And what I tell people is, don't look at just where Indigenous people or local, traditions are included. Look at where they're absent, because I think it really does become incumbent on us to say, this might not be specifically about Indigenous people, but there are Indigenous considerations that need to be taken into account. So I think the same for the Green New Deal. I think it's really important, but we're even seeing, here for the CARES Act funding, we're sort of economy rebuilding is going to non-Indigenous led organizations and sort of weirdly trickling down maybe to Indigenous groups. And again, that's where you really have to say funding should be directed at Indigenous people to lead environmental efforts. So I'm really supportive of, the Green New Deal, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done to make it just and productive and sustainable. So I think it has a ways to go.
And very quickly, I'm just going to add like my 10-second thing. When any legislation or any proposed solution involves carbon, there's a couple things that we have to remember. One, most of the carbon that's still in our lands and still in our environments are probably on Indigenous lands. So unless there's some recognition of the protection and even reacquisition of Indigenous lands, that solution is probably going to fail. And two, we can't talk about soil and carbon without talking about like the alteration of natural waterways and the deforestation of some of our Indigenous landscapes. Like when it comes to carbon, there are some very practical and real places that Indigenous people need to be specifically spelled out.
Great, thanks. So I think we have time for one more question because we're almost at the hour. And I'm happy to share with panelists the questions that we weren't able to get to. And I don't want to guarantee that all of your questions will get answered, but we'll do what we can because you guys have jobs and are busy, right? But I thought this was important. So there was a question about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and there's often it's often focused on Black and Brown individuals. It doesn't always get to Indigenous people. So where do you see Indigenous people within that? To use the jargony term in philanthropy, DEI conversation.
I'll start very quickly. One, I think there is a shared experience between people of color. Yes, the history of this country has been atrocious and it's created a shared experience. So that we have in common. But the impacts of those experiences have been very different on our communities, and they have reflected very different reactions from our communities. And if the impact is different, for sure, the solutions to that shared experience need to be different. We're looking at Hawaii as an independent nation. We're looking at tribal communities as independent nations. And so I think I recognize, First Nations recognizes this shared experience of such an atrocious history, but the impacts and solutions are really different when we're talking about specific communities.
All right, thanks. Any other thoughts? If not, there's so many good, go ahead, yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one thing and something different that I saw someone post in there, and I know we're at time, but they asked about the youth. And I just want to say that uplifting our youth and what they're doing has been electric. They are really stepping up. They're talking about climate, and I just wanted to give a shout out because I'm just seeing the good work that they're doing, not just here in Alaska, but everywhere. They're really pushing these conversations. And I always want to work in to make sure that we're making space for them at our tables. And it's not like we're going to have a separate panel to talk for the youth. No, they need to be in all of our conversations. Just like Indigenous people need to be in all of our conversations, our youth and our elders need to be there. Our elders have so much knowledge to share, and our youth, our future generation, need to be involved in these decision making. So just want to say thanks. I know someone brought up the youth, and I really want to uplift them and uplift the work that they're doing.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. And I think one of the questions is what can individuals do? And certainly that's one thing, make sure that you're reaching out to both youth and elders. So thank you.
And I'll just end and answer that question. Again, for those who are not Indigenous, allyships and support is critical. I see so many participants on this, like Mickey Sager from the Conservation Fund, who nominated our nonprofit for something. I mean, Steve, you and Cassandra. I think, again, creating space and opportunity we are so grateful for that, because we really don't have the network and the access and those things that other organizations do. So I very much recognize that the fact that we're turning a corner comes because people really have started to help and reach out and mentor. And so I just wanted to, again, thank you and those who really have become champions of Indigenous peoples, and just say thank you for this opportunity. It's been wonderful. I enjoyed this very much.
Well, I want to wrap things up. Thanks so much, Kehau, Ade, and Kendra for your contributions. We have people's contact information there, so you can reach the panelists directly. Thanks so much to all of you who are in attendance for your excellent questions, and we got to as many as we can, and we'll try to follow up with a few of the other ones as best we can. So thanks again, really fascinating and important conversation. Really appreciate everyone's time.